She gave away her only meal to a stranger and never told a soul. But the man who tasted that cornbread saw something in her eyes that no one else had bothered to look for. What happened next would change both their lives forever, and an entire frontier town would never be the same. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. If it moves you, hit like and stay until the very end. You won't regret it. The summer Caleb Mercer turned 26, the drought came back. It wasn't the worst drought the territory had seen. Old-timers would remind you of that, unprompted, every chance they got. But it was bad enough. Bad enough that 3 ranches east of Pine Ridge had already folded by June. Bad enough that the creek running along the south edge of Caleb's property had dropped to a thin, sorry trickle that his cattle refused to drink from without being pushed. Bad enough that when Caleb rode into town on a Thursday evening in late August, covered in dust from collar to boot heel, he felt something close to despair sitting in his chest like a swallowed stone. He wasn't a man given to despair. His father had raised him to believe that complaining was the first step toward failure, and somewhere along the way, that lesson had calcified into something harder, a refusal to acknowledge when things were genuinely difficult. So instead of calling it despair, he called it tiredness, climbed down from his horse outside the Pine Ridge boarding house, tied the reins to the post, and went inside to eat. The boarding house was run by a woman named Dottie Crane, who was 60 years old, wide as a doorframe, and possessed of the kind of personality that filled every room she entered until there was no space left for anyone else. She was fond of Caleb in the way that older women in small towns were fond of young men who owned land and kept their boots reasonably clean. She seated him near the window, poured his coffee without being asked, and told him about her hip. He listened with half his attention. The other half was on the room. It was crowded for a Thursday. That was the drought's doing too. When people got scared, they gathered. The boarding house became a place to trade rumors about which wells were holding, which weren't, and who might be selling. There were ranchers Caleb recognized, a couple of traveling merchants, a family from somewhere east passing through. The noise of it all pressed against the walls. He hadn't meant to watch the kitchen, but there was a door propped open at the back of the room, and through it he could see the stove and the work table. And at the work table there was a woman he didn't recognize. Not at first. She was slight, dark-haired, maybe 22 or 23, moving with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned very early that stillness cost time she didn't have. She was cutting cornbread into squares, her face tipped down, her expression unreadable. She wore a plain gray dress that had been washed so many times it had surrendered most of its original color. There was a smudge of flour on her left forearm. "Who's that?" Caleb asked. Dottie glanced back. "Who's what?" "The woman in the kitchen." "Oh." Dottie's interest in the subject was visible in how quickly it ended. "That's Mara. She cooks for me. Orphan girl, been here 2 years, something like that. Good worker." Something like that. Caleb nodded and said nothing more about it. The room filled, the supper was served, and Dottie brought him a plate that included a square of cornbread in the corner. He ate the beans first, the salt pork, a piece of boiled potato that had gone slightly soft. He saved the cornbread for last, the way he always had since childhood, the way his mother had taught him without ever meaning to by always making it the best thing on the table. He took a bite. He set the fork down. He picked up the cornbread and looked at it, which was a strange thing to do, and he knew it, but he couldn't help it. Because it wasn't just good cornbread. It was the kind of cornbread that made you think of something specific, a kitchen, a season, an hour of the day. It had that quality that food almost never has, where it doesn't just feed you, but tells you something. He tasted butter, and something faintly sweet, and beneath that a slight smokiness from the cast iron, and the texture was exactly right, dense but not heavy, crumbling only when you meant it to. He hadn't eaten anything that good in years. He wasn't the type to make a fuss about food in public. He'd always thought that kind of thing belonged to city people, the sort who traveled somewhere specific to eat and talked about it afterward at length. But he found himself turning toward the kitchen door and raising his voice over the general noise. "Excuse me," he said. Not loudly, but loud enough. The room didn't exactly go quiet, but the nearest conversations paused. Heads turned. Through the kitchen door he saw the dark-haired woman look up. Her hands went still on the work table. "This cornbread," Caleb said. He held up what remained of it. "Did you make this?" Her eyes moved from his face to the cornbread and back again. There was a wariness in the look, the kind of caution that came from experience, from having learned that when strangers drew attention to you, it was rarely because they had something good to say. "Yes," she said. Her voice was quiet, steady. "It's the best thing I've eaten in a long time," he said. "I mean that. Whatever you put in it, it's something." The room had definitely gone quieter by then. People were looking at her. Caleb was looking at her. And for a moment, just a moment, the guarded expression on her face shifted, and he saw something underneath it that he couldn't quite name. Not pleasure, exactly, or not just pleasure. Something more complicated. Something that looked almost like surprise, the surprise of a person who has received something they had stopped expecting to receive. Then it was gone. She dipped her head. "Thank you," she said, and she went back to cutting. But Caleb sat with the rest of his cornbread and that image in his head, that brief, unguarded moment, and felt inexplicably like he'd just glimpsed something that most people in that room had been looking past for years. He came back the following Thursday. He told himself it was because he needed to talk to Bill Hatcher, who ran the feed store and who was usually at the boarding house on Thursday evenings to argue with anyone who disagreed with him about politics, prices, or the weather. And that was true, more or less. He did talk to Bill. But he also had the cornbread again, and this time he made a point of arriving early enough to watch how the supper service ran. She was everywhere and nowhere at once. That was the only way he could describe it, looking back. Mara Quinn moved through the work of feeding 30-odd people with a quietness that made her almost invisible, and Caleb had the unsettling sense that this invisibility was not an accident. She had learned how to occupy space without asserting it, how to be present without being noticed. The other women who helped Dottie, 2 local girls who came in for the evening service, talked to each other constantly, laughed, occasionally dropped things. Mara said very little and dropped nothing. He watched her notice a man near the back who was struggling to eat because his right hand was bandaged. Without a word, without drawing attention to it, she brought him a spoon and repositioned his plate. He barely looked at her. She didn't seem to need him to. He watched her intercept a little girl of about 6 who had wandered away from her family and was about to pull a full coffee pot off the edge of a side table. She caught the child's arm, set the pot safely back, and crouched down to say something that made the girl laugh before steering her back toward her parents. No one noticed except Caleb. He watched her eat. Or rather, he watched her not eat, which was when he started to pay closer attention. The boarding house served family style, and there was usually food left at the end of the service. Not much, but some. The girls who helped Dottie ate at the kitchen table after the guests finished. Mara sat with them, but ate less than either of them, and she ate quickly, with the focused practicality of someone who had learned to treat food as fuel rather than pleasure. It occurred to him that she probably didn't have much, that the boarding house job was room and board plus a small wage, and that her portion of supper was likely whatever was still there after the guests were satisfied. He thought about that on the ride home. He came back the Thursday after that, and the one after that. By October, he had learned, mostly through watching and occasional brief exchanges at the kitchen door, that her name was Mara Quinn, that she had grown up in a children's home in a town 3 days east of Pine Ridge, that she had come to Pine Ridge at 20 after the home closed and she was turned out with 37 cents and a single change of clothing, and that she had worked for Dottie Crane ever since. He learned that she could stretch a pound of salt pork further than anyone he'd ever seen, that she grew herbs in 3 cracked pots on the kitchen windowsill and used them in ways that made the same basic ingredients taste different every week, and that she had, at some point, taught herself to read from discarded newspapers and could quote, with perfect recall, passages from articles that had interested her. He learned that last thing by accident when he made some offhand comment about a territorial dispute he'd read about, and she had said not looking up from the dough she was working. The Beaumont Survey of 1871 established the eastern boundary 3 miles south of where that claim sits. Whoever's arguing it doesn't have a case. He had stared at her. She had glanced up, registered his expression, and gone back to the dough. "The territorial paper ran the full survey last spring," she said, by way of explanation, as if she expected him to be surprised that she read, and wanted to clarify before he said anything patronizing. He hadn't said anything patronizing, but he'd thought about that exchange for a long time afterward, because it told him something. It told him that she was accustomed to being underestimated. The autumn festival in Pine Ridge was the biggest social event of the year, which was not saying as much as the town liked to think it was saying. It ran for 2 days in mid-October, with a fiddle band, barrel races for the younger men, a pie contest that 3 women in particular treated as a matter of serious personal honor, and a dance on the second night that started at sundown and went until people either ran out of energy or whiskey, usually in that order. Caleb went because it was expected of him. As one of the larger landholders in the county, his absence would have been noted and remarked upon, and he had enough to deal with without adding that. He wore his better shirt, had a conversation with the county commissioner about water rights that went nowhere, watched the barrel races, ate a piece of pie that came in second place and deserved first, and waited to feel something resembling enjoyment. He didn't, particularly. The dance started. He stood at the edge of the cleared ground where the band had set up, holding a cup of cider, and watched the town turn into a different version of itself, looser, louder, the ordinary shapes of people softened by firelight and music. He had danced in years past. He wasn't bad at it, but dancing required a partner, and the available women were either already dancing with someone related to him or looking at him with the particular expression of women who had assessed his land holdings and found them satisfactory and were hoping he'd notice. He noticed. He just didn't feel like being noticed back. He had almost decided to leave when he saw her. She was not at the dance exactly. She was behind the serving tables that had been set up along the east edge of the festival ground, long boards across sawhorses loaded with the food that various families had brought. She and 2 other women were managing the serving, and they had been doing it for most of the evening, and she looked tired in the particular way of people who have been standing on their feet for 6 hours. Her hair had come partially loose at the back. There was a stain on her apron that she'd stopped trying to hide. The 2 women she was working with had managed to step away. One to dance, one to speak with someone who had come to collect her for the evening, and she was alone at the table, watching the dancing from a distance that might as well have been a mile. He didn't think about it much. He set his cider down on a nearby fence post and walked over. "Miss Quinn?" She looked up. The wariness came first, automatic, and then faded when she recognized him. "Mr. Mercer, you've been back here all evening. Someone needs to be. Do they? It seems to me the food will keep for an hour." She glanced at the table, then at the dancing, then at him, with the expression of someone calculating something. "It needs to be restocked," she said. "In the next half hour?" "Possibly." "I don't think so," he said pleasantly. "I think you've been standing back here watching everyone else dance and talking yourself out of wanting to be over there." She said nothing, which was, he'd learned, not the same as agreeing. "I'm asking you to dance, Mara," he said, "if you're willing." The expression on her face did something complicated then. He saw the refusal forming, the polite, practiced deflection, and he saw it stop. She looked at him for a moment with something he could only describe as searching, like she was trying to find the catch. "People will talk," she said finally. "People talk anyway. That's what people do. They'll say things." "Probably," he agreed. "Does that change whether you want to dance?" A beat of silence. Then she untied her apron, folded it, and set it on the edge of the table. "I should tell you," she said, "that I'm not very good." "Neither am I," he said. "We'll be exactly matched." He was lying. She was better than she'd admitted, and found out within 30 seconds that he was lying too, and called him on it. "You said you weren't good," she said, slightly breathless, as he turned her through a fast reel, and he laughed, actually laughed, in a way he hadn't in longer than he could remember, and said, "I said I wasn't very good. That was accurate." They danced twice. She was light on her feet and picked up the steps quickly, and had a way of moving that suggested she had more rhythm than she'd ever had occasion to use. People did look. He'd been right about that. He caught the eyes of 2 women near the edge of the crowd who were already leaning together to speak, and he looked back at them without changing his expression until they looked away. After the second dance, they stood to the side and she was flushed from the movement. Her hair more thoroughly escaped now, and she looked, for those few minutes, like a different person. Or maybe the same person with the careful camouflage removed. "Thank you," she said. She meant it. He could tell by the fact that she said it simply, without the reflexive over-politeness she usually used to keep people at a distance. "Thank you," he said. And then, because he had been thinking about this for several weeks and had not yet found a natural way to say it, "I'd like to talk to you about something, if you're willing. Not tonight. It's not the right place. But soon." She looked at him. "What kind of something?" "A job," he said. "At my ranch, if you'd consider it." The flush from the dancing was still in her face, but her expression had shifted back into caution. "Doing what?" "Managing the house, mostly. Cooking. But more than that, too. I've got 4 ranch hands and an operation that's held together mostly by stubbornness and luck, and I could use someone with a good head and good judgment to help me run the household side of things properly." He paused. "I'd pay you fairly. Better than you're making here. And you'd have your own room, not shared." She looked at him for a long time. "Why me?" she asked. And the way she said it, he understood she wasn't fishing for a compliment. She genuinely wanted to know. "Because," he said, "in 6 weeks of watching you work, I have not once seen you do anything stupid. And stupid is a lot more common than people think." She almost smiled. "Not quite, but almost." "I'll think about it," she said. "That's all I'm asking." She said yes 4 days later. She came by the ranch on a Tuesday morning, riding in a wagon she'd borrowed from Dottie's husband, with everything she owned in a flour sack and a small wooden box that she carried down from the wagon herself before Caleb could offer to help. She stood in the yard and looked at the house, which was solid, not grand, the kind of house a practical man built for function first and everything else if there was time. And then she looked at him. "I have some conditions," she said. He had not expected that. "All right. I'll manage the kitchen and the household. I'll answer for what goes wrong in those areas, but I won't be managed in how I do it. If something's not working, I'll tell you. If something is working, I'd appreciate not having it changed for no reason." "Fair enough." "And I'll need a budget, not whatever's left after everything else. An actual budget, set at the beginning of the month, so I can plan properly." "Also fair." She regarded him. "You agreed to those awfully fast." "They're reasonable," he said. "Did you expect me to argue?" "Most people would. Most employers would." "Well," he said, "I'm not going to. Are there more conditions?" "Just one." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not here to be talked about, by you or the hands. If someone has something to say about me or to me, they can say it to my face." "I'll make that clear," he said. "Good." She picked up her flour sack. "Then show me the kitchen." The kitchen needed work, not structurally. It was a serviceable space, well-proportioned, with a good stove and adequate light from the east-facing window. But it had been managed for years by whoever was available to manage it, which meant it had been managed inconsistently, which meant things were stored in ways that made no sense. Tools were missing or in the wrong places, and there were gaps in the pantry that spoke of someone who bought provisions reactively rather than with any planning. She didn't say any of this on the first day. She walked through the kitchen slowly, opened every cabinet, pulled out the pantry contents, and looked at them, checked what was stored where and what wasn't stored at all, and wrote things down in a small notebook she kept in her apron pocket. When she cooked supper that first evening, she did it with what was there: salt pork, dried beans, some onions that were just starting to turn and needed to be used. And she made it good anyway, because that was what she knew how to do. The 4 ranch hands, Pete Garvey, the brothers Tom and Danny Aldous, and an older man named Roy Stubbs, who had been with the ranch for 11 years and was generally suspicious of anyone new, ate it without comment, which was the way ranch hands showed approval. Roy ate 2 helpings, which was rarer than comment. Caleb cleaned his plate and said, "That was very good." Mara, who was eating at the far end of the table in the seat she had chosen herself on that first evening and never relinquished, said, "Tomorrow will be better. I needed to see what I had to work with." Pete Garvey, who was 23 and not particularly careful with his mouth, said, "What was wrong with tonight?" "Nothing was wrong with it," she said. "Better and wrong aren't the same thing." Pete looked like he was going to say something else. Roy Stubbs gave him a look that stopped him. Roy was the oldest person at the table and had calibrated something in Mara's manner in those first 90 seconds that Pete would take another 2 weeks to figure out. The garden was the thing that surprised him most. Behind the house there was a kitchen garden plot, or what had once been a kitchen garden plot, before whoever had tended it stopped tending it, probably 3 years before. It was overgrown with weeds, the raised beds collapsed, the soil compacted and pale. He had long since stopped seeing it, the way you stop seeing things that have been broken long enough. She saw it on her third day. He was crossing the yard toward the barn when he caught sight of her standing at the edge of the overgrown plot, looking at it the way he'd seen surveyors look at land they were assessing. Arms crossed, weight back on one heel, eyes moving systematically from one end to the other. "That's not worth dealing with," he said. "The soil's probably too far gone." She looked at him. "No, it isn't. It's been sitting for years. Soil doesn't die in years. It takes a lot longer than that to kill soil properly." She turned back to the plot. "I'll need some things. Straw, if you have it. Compost, if there's any. Fence wire to keep animals out." "You're planning to put work into that?" "I'm planning to put work into having food through the winter that doesn't come entirely out of the dry goods barrel," she said. "It's the same thing." He got her the straw. He got her the fence wire. He watched, on a Sunday when there was a gap in the other work, as she moved through the old beds methodically, pulling weeds with both hands, working around the established plants that had survived by stubbornness, turning the soil with a spade she'd sharpened herself because the one in the tool shed was blunt. Roy came to stand beside Caleb, watching from a distance. "Huh," Roy said. "Yeah," Caleb said. "That plot's been dead since Mrs. Hargrove left," Roy said. Mrs. Hargrove was the woman who'd managed the house 2 managers before Mara, who had lasted 8 months and then departed in circumstances nobody discussed. "Apparently not," Caleb said. Roy was quiet for a moment. "She's not what I expected," he said. He didn't elaborate, but Caleb understood what he meant, because he felt it too. That quality of Mara's that revealed itself gradually, like a landscape emerging from morning fog. You thought you saw the shape of her, and then more would emerge, and then more, until you realized you'd been seeing a much smaller version of the whole. In November, one of the ranch hands found a dog on the East Road. Or rather, the dog found them. A half-grown shepherd mutt, ribs countable through its coat, limping on a front leg that had been hurt somehow and was healing wrong. Pete had brought it back to the ranch because Pete was sentimental about animals in the way that tough young men often were and tried to pretend they weren't. He tied it to the fence post near the barn and said it could work cattle once it was healed, as if the dog's presence required practical justification. The dog did not cooperate with this premise. It was nervous around the cattle, terrified of Roy for reasons that suggested its history with older men had not been good, and skittish around anything loud or sudden. Pete's plan for a cattle dog was not going to work out, but the dog, it turned out, took to Mara immediately. Caleb saw it happen. She was coming out of the kitchen door with a pan of scraps for the compost heap, and the dog was in the yard, unattended because Pete had forgotten to retie it. It saw her, went still, watched her with the particular wariness of an animal that has learned wariness as a survival strategy. She saw it, slowed, set the pan down on the step, and lowered herself into a crouch. She didn't reach toward it. She just waited. The dog watched her for a long time. Then it moved a step closer. Then another. She still didn't move. Eventually it came close enough to smell her hand, and she let it. And then slowly, very slowly, she let one finger rest against its nose, and then its jaw, and then the side of its head. The dog's tail, which had been held low, moved once. Caleb, watching from the barn door, felt something shift in his chest. He couldn't have said exactly what. It was something about the way she waited, the patience of it, the understanding that some things come toward you only if you give them the space to do so. She named the dog Pepper, which Pete objected to on the grounds that it wasn't a working name. And she informed him that Pepper wasn't his dog, and therefore his opinion on the name was not relevant, and Pete subsided. Pepper slept in the kitchen. By January, he had learned to alert when strangers came into the yard, to fetch Mara's apron when she put it down in the wrong place, and to climb onto the foot of the empty bed in the spare room that Mara slept in, which she had told Caleb she intended to prevent, and evidently had not. "He's not supposed to be on the furniture," Caleb said once, passing the open door and seeing the dog sprawled across the end of the bed. Mara, who was mending a shirt, didn't look up. "I know. You're not doing anything about it." "No." He waited. "Why not?" She looked up then, and there was something in her expression that was drier and warmer than her usual manner. Because I used to sleep on a cot in a room with 7 other girls at the home, and half of them kicked in their sleep, and if Pepper wants to sleep at the foot of my bed, I think that's probably fine. He didn't have an answer to that. Okay, he said, and moved on. December came cold and clear, the kind of winter that was beautiful to look at and brutal to work in. The cattle needed extra hay, the water troughs iced overnightly and needed breaking each morning, and the days grew short enough that they were starting and ending work in darkness. Inside the ranch house, things were different. Mara had been there 3 months, and the house had changed in ways that were harder to quantify than the garden or the kitchen organization. It was warmer, partly because she was more careful about the fires, but also in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. There was food at predictable times. There was order without rigidity. The hands argued less at the table, which Caleb attributed to Roy, but suspected was actually Mara, who had a way of speaking quietly into conflict that seemed to let air out of it before it could fully inflate. He had started watching for her in the mornings. He noticed this about himself and did not particularly like it. Not because it was shameful. There was nothing shameful in noticing that someone's presence had become a fixed point in his day, but because he was aware of the complications. She worked for him. She had come to this ranch in a vulnerable position, without many options, and the last thing a person in that position needed was an employer who had started looking at them with feelings that went sideways of professionalism. He was careful. He was careful the way a man is careful around something he is afraid of breaking, with deliberate attention and a slight physical distance that he didn't fully realize he was maintaining until she noticed. "You've been avoiding me," she said one evening in mid-December. He looked up from the accounts he'd been pretending to study. She was in the doorway of the sitting room with a cup of coffee that was ostensibly for him, which was her habit in the evenings when he worked late. "I haven't been avoiding you," he said. "You've been politely avoiding me," she said, which is different from general avoidance, but the same in practice. He opened his mouth, and then he closed it because she was right, and they both knew it. She set the coffee on the edge of the desk. "If I've done something wrong," she said, with the careful steadiness of someone who expects the answer might be yes, "I'd rather you told me." "You haven't done anything wrong. Then why—" "Because," he said, and stopped. She waited. He looked at her, standing in the doorway in the lamplight, and thought about the dozen carefully reasonable things he could say, and didn't say any of them. "Because I've been trying to be careful," he said, "and I'm not certain I've been doing it for the right reasons." She was quiet for a long moment. "Careful of what?" she asked. "Of this," he said. "Of making things complicated. You work here. You came here because you needed work. I don't want to be—" He stopped again. "I don't want to be a problem for you." She considered that. Her expression was unreadable, which was unusual for someone he'd spent 3 months learning to read fairly well. "That's a complicated way," she said finally, "of saying you're not sure how I feel." "Yes," he said, "that's exactly what it is." She picked up her own coffee cup, which she had apparently brought for herself as well, and looked at the fire. "I don't have a lot of experience with people treating my feelings as something relevant to what they do," she said. "Most people don't ask." "I'm asking." She turned to look at him directly, which was the kind of thing she did that always caught him slightly off guard, because she held eye contact in a way that didn't waver. "I don't know," she said. "I'm telling you honestly. I don't know what I feel yet. I know that working here is the first time in my life I've had enough room to feel something that isn't just exhaustion or worry." She paused. "That's not nothing." "No," he said. "That's not nothing." She nodded, once, as if they had reached a conclusion. "Then let's not make it complicated yet," she said. "Let's just let it be what it is." He picked up the coffee. "That sounds reasonable." "I'm generally reasonable," she said, and left, and he heard her moving down the hallway to the kitchen, and the dog following at her heels, and the sound of the fire settling. He sat there with his coffee and the accounts he wasn't reading, and the particular sensation of a man who has said something real to another person and had something real said back, and thought that the house felt different than it had in October, than it had in August, than it had in all the years he'd lived in it alone. He thought of the cornbread, of the look on her face when he'd praised it in front of a room full of people who didn't know her name. He drank the coffee. It was very good. Outside, the December wind moved against the house, and the house held. January arrived with a week of ice storms that shut down the eastern road and kept everyone on the property. 5 people and 1 dog in a ranch house for 7 days straight, with nowhere to go and nothing to do but work and wait. If there was ever a condition designed to expose the real texture of people, that was it. The hands handled it the way men handle enforced proximity, by finding smaller and smaller things to argue about. Tom and Danny Aldous, who had been bickering their entire lives with the particular efficiency of brothers, escalated a dispute about whose turn it was to break the water troughs into a 3-day silence that filled the kitchen with something close to weather. Pete Garvey dealt with the confinement by talking more than usual, which was already a lot. Roy Stubbs retreated into a quietness so complete it was almost architectural. Caleb found himself grateful, in a way he hadn't anticipated, for Mara. Not because she fixed any of it, she didn't try to, but she had a way of moving through tension without feeding it, and that turned out to be rarer and more valuable than fixing. She didn't mediate the brothers or shush Pete or draw Roy out of his silence. She simply continued doing what she did, cooking, managing, keeping the household in motion. And the steadiness of that, the sheer reliability of it, seemed to provide something to orient around. When everything else was irritable and stuck, the kitchen smelled like something worth coming inside for. Supper was on time. The coffee was always hot. On the 4th day of the ice storm, Tom Aldous came into the kitchen in the late afternoon while she was making bread and sat down at the table without saying anything. She let him sit. She didn't ask what was wrong. She put a cup of coffee in front of him after a few minutes, the way you'd set something down for an animal that's spooked and needs time before it can accept help. Caleb saw this from the doorway and didn't come in. Tom sat there for 20 minutes. Eventually he said, "Danny's impossible." "Brothers usually are," she said. "He's been that way my whole life." "That's how it works." Tom was quiet again. "You have any siblings?" he asked. She paused in her kneading. "No," she said. "Not exactly." She seemed to consider whether to say more, and then said, "I grew up with other children in a home. Not family, exactly, but not family, either. Some of them I still think about." Tom looked at his coffee. "What happened to them?" "They scattered," she said simply. "The way people do when the thing holding them together stops holding." She went back to the bread. "Go talk to your brother, not to win, just to talk." Tom made a sound that was not agreement and not refusal, but he finished his coffee and went. Caleb stepped back from the doorway before anyone could see he'd been there. He stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the ice knock against the window glass, and thought about what it must be like to scatter. To be a person whose only family is made of accident and circumstance and is then taken away. To understand at 20 years old that you are completely alone and have to build something from nothing, starting with 37 cents. He thought about her at the boarding house, the way she'd move through an evening of work, steady and unnoticed, and then sit down to eat whatever was left. He thought about the portion of that supper he'd eaten, the cornbread, and something he hadn't fully considered before shifted in him. What exactly had she eaten that night? He filed the question away. It would come back to him later, much later, in a way he wasn't prepared for. The ice broke on the 6th day and the road opened, and the tension in the house released like a held breath. Pete went into town for supplies he didn't strictly need, just to feel the motion of going somewhere. The brothers fell back into their ordinary lower-level hostility, which functioned more as background noise than genuine conflict. Roy went back to being quiet in a way that was peaceful rather than dense. Life resumed its shape, but something had shifted, small and difficult to name. The ice storm had pushed people against each other and against themselves, and what came out on the other side was a household that had been, in some way, tested and found sufficient. Even Roy, who had regarded Mara's arrival with the polite suspicion he reserved for all change, had quietly begun to include her in his understanding of how things worked on the property. She was no longer new, she was part of the place. February brought a problem no one had expected. One of the cattle, a young heifer at the edge of the herd, had injured her leg sometime during the ice and had been hiding it in the way animals do, until she was limping badly enough that Pete caught it on his morning check. The leg wasn't broken, but it was swollen and hot to the touch, and the nearest animal doctor was a day's ride away and unlikely to make the trip for a single heifer. Caleb was examining the animal in the pen when he heard the gate open behind him and turned to find Mara. She had her coat over her kitchen clothes and Pepper trotting behind her. Pete said there was a hurt animal, she said. Heifer. Legs infected, maybe. I don't think it's broken. She came to the fence and looked at the animal with the same assessing attention she'd given the dead garden. Then she came through the gate, which surprised him, and moved toward the heifer slowly and deliberately, the way she'd moved toward Pepper that first time. She got close enough to crouch down and look at the leg without touching it yet, and the heifer, rather than shying back, stayed still in a way that Caleb's presence hadn't quite achieved. There are poultices, she said, for swelling and heat. I learned them at the home. They use them for people mostly, but the principle's the same. You think that would work on a cow? She stood and looked at him. I think it's either that or the vet in a day and a half, and by then the infection's worse. Do you have any dried yarrow or comfrey? I have no idea what those are. Then I need to look in my herb stores. She patted the heifer's neck once, just once, and came back through the gate. Give me an hour. He gave her the hour. And then he gave her another, because she came back with a cloth soaked in something that smelled of green and earth and applied it to the leg while Pete held the animal still. And she did it without any of the hesitation of someone guessing. She came back twice the following day to change it. By the third day, the swelling had gone down noticeably. By the end of the week, the heifer was walking normally. Pete told the story in town and made it bigger, the way Pete told stories. Roy said nothing about it to anyone but asked Mara, with a formality that was his version of vulnerability, whether she knew anything about the joint pain he'd been carrying in his left hand for 3 winters. She said she might. She made him something to soak it in. Mornings, and whether it was the remedy or the ritual or just time, he stopped mentioning the pain. After that, Roy Stubbs would have followed her into a burning building. By spring, the ranch was different. Not dramatically, not in ways you could photograph or put in a ledger, but in the texture of daily life, in the small recognitions between people who have figured out how to work alongside each other without too much friction. The hands had learned Mara's rhythms, that she needed the kitchen clear between 2 and 4 in the afternoon when she did her serious cooking, that she would feed anyone who was hungry if they asked without making a production of asking, that she did not respond well to being startled, and that if she was quiet at breakfast, it meant she was thinking about something and you should let her think. She had learned theirs. She knew Pete needed to be heard before he could listen, that Tom would do anything if you gave him a specific task, but nothing if you left it vague, that Danny worked better alone and should be assigned accordingly, that Roy was the one you went to when something was actually wrong because he would tell you the truth without any of the performance, the younger man added. Caleb she had still not entirely figured out, and he suspected she knew that, because occasionally she would look at him with the focused concentration of a person reading a text in a language they mostly but not entirely knew. He hadn't said anything more about feelings or about December's kitchen doorway conversation. He wasn't sure what to say. She had told him she didn't know yet what she felt, and he was trying to respect that, but respecting it and not thinking about it were not the same discipline, and he was better at the first than the second. One evening in March, he came in late from checking the south fence line, mud to the knee, and tired enough that he was mostly running on stubbornness. The kitchen was quiet. He expected it to be empty. Instead, Mara was at the table with her notebook and a lamp, writing something, Pepper asleep at her feet. She looked up when he came in. There's soup on the stove, she said. You don't need to wait up, he said. I wasn't waiting up. I was writing. She looked at him more closely. You look terrible. Thank you. Sit down. I'll get the soup. He sat because he was too tired to argue, and because being told to sit down and have something to eat was a thing he had not realized until that moment that he had missed for a very long time. His mother used to do it. There was something in that simple domestic instruction, sit, you're tired, there's food, that carried a kind of care that didn't announce itself, that just existed. She put the bowl in front of him and went back to her chair. He ate, and she wrote, and the fire settled, and Pepper's breathing was the primary sound in the room. It was quiet in the best possible sense. The kind of quiet that isn't the absence of conversation, but the presence of two people comfortable enough with each other not to need it. What are you writing? He asked finally. Letters, she said, to people from the home. Some of them I lost track of, some I didn't. You keep in touch with them? I try. Some of them write back, some don't. She dipped her pen. There's a girl, woman now, she's 19, who ended up in a town further west. She's not doing well, last I heard. What kind of not well? Mara was quiet for a moment. The kind that happens when you're 19 and alone and someone offers you something that feels like safety but isn't. She said it flatly, not dramatically, as a statement of a thing she understood clearly. I try to write to her regularly, so she knows someone's paying attention. He looked at her across the table. She was focused on the letter, her handwriting small and careful, pressing firmly enough to make every word clear. And he thought about what it meant to be a person whose instinct, when they learned that someone else was struggling, was to write letters. Not to fix it, she knew she couldn't fix it, but to pay attention, to make the other person feel seen. He thought about the boarding house, about a crowded dining room and a woman behind a kitchen door and a room full of people who collectively could not have told you her first name. Mara, he said. She looked up. Can I ask you something personal? She considered this. Probably. Before I came to the boarding house, before I started coming back, was there anyone in town who knew you? Not just knew who you were, but actually knew you. She held the pen still over the paper. Dottie was kind to me, she said carefully. That's not what I asked. She looked at him for a moment, and then something in her face did what it sometimes did, released a layer. No, she said. Not really. 2 years. 2 years, she confirmed. He thought about that. 2 years in a town where everyone knew everyone, where the social architecture was built from visibility and connection, and she had been there the whole time, feeding people, invisible. How did you stand it? He asked. And then, I'm sorry, that's Tretamirs de tempo sport. No, she said. It's a fair question. She set the pen down. You learn to make small things matter. The herbs on the windowsill, getting a recipe exactly right, a letter back from someone you used to know. She paused. And you tell yourself that being unnoticed isn't the same as being unimportant. You tell yourself that enough times, and sometimes you even believe it. Sometimes. The word sat there. I noticed, he said, for whatever that's worth. She looked at him steadily. It's worth more than you probably think, she said. And then she picked up the pen and went back to the letter, and he finished the soup, and the fire burned lower, and neither of them said anything more that night. But something had moved between them, quiet as the Peppers' breathing, solid as the walls of the house around them. April came with mud and new calves and 18-hour days that left everyone too tired for anything but sleep. Caleb hired 2 additional seasonal hands for the calving, which doubled the cooking burden, and Mara absorbed this without complaint, but with a reorganization of the kitchen that was impressive in its efficiency. She put Danny Aldous in charge of breakfast. He could make eggs and wouldn't resent being given a specific task, and focused her own energy on the midday and evening meals, when the calving hands needed something substantial enough to sustain the kind of work that ate through a man. She slept less than anyone on the property during April. He knew this because he was often up before dawn himself, and the kitchen lamp was always already lit when he came through. She would be at the stove or at the work table, moving through the early preparation with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything she did. Sometimes Pepper would be watching her from the corner, tracking her movements with the attentiveness of a dog that had organized its world around a single person. You're going to wear yourself out, he told her one morning in the second week of April. She handed him his coffee. I'll sleep in May. That's not how bodies work. I know how my body works, she said, not unkindly. I've been running it hard for 6 years. It'll hold. He didn't push it, because there was a quality to her stubbornness that he'd learned to distinguish from recklessness. She wasn't careless. She knew exactly what she was doing and what it cost, and she had made her calculation. Pushing past it would be treating her like someone who needed to be managed, which was the thing she'd made clear from her first day she would not tolerate. But he started leaving wood already cut and stacked inside the kitchen door in the mornings, so she didn't have to go outside for it in the cold. She didn't mention this. Neither did he. The calving season ended and the seasonal hands left, and the ranch settled back into its 5-person rhythm. The morning of the last day of April, Caleb came downstairs to find Mara sitting at the kitchen table with both hands around a coffee cup, not moving, staring at nothing in particular. Pepper was in her lap, which the dog was too large for, but persisted in attempting regardless. She looked tired in a way that went deeper than one night's sleep could reach, the kind of tired that accumulates. He got his coffee. He sat down across from her, not at the head of the table but across, which was different. She registered this, he could tell, but she didn't say anything. May, he said. May, she agreed. Sleep. She almost smiled. The corner of her mouth moved. Starting tomorrow. He set his cup down and looked at her directly, the way she looked at people, not turning away when it became uncomfortable. I want to say something to you, he said, and I want you to let me say the whole thing before you say anything back. She looked at him. She nodded once. This ranch is a better place than it was 8 months ago, he said. Not because you cook well, or because you fixed the garden, or because Roy's hand stopped hurting, or because that heifer is alive. It's a better place because of how you are in it. The way you pay attention, the way you see what people need before they know how to ask. The way you... He stopped himself from going further into sentiment than he was comfortable with. I want you to know that's not invisible to me. And I want you to know that whatever you need, more time, space, different work, more money, whatever would make things better for you. You tell me and we'll figure it out. She looked at him for a long moment. Why are you telling me this now? Because it's May, he said, and because I've been meaning to say it since January, and I keep waiting for a better moment and there isn't one. She was quiet. Then she said, the money would help. I've been sending some to the girl I told you about, the one out west. He had not expected that. You've been sending her money. Some, not much, but some. She said it without embarrassment, matter-of-factly, the way she said things she didn't feel required defense. If you raised my wage by... Done, he said. She stopped. You don't know what I was going to say. Whatever it is, done. You're underpaid already. She studied him. You're very easy to negotiate with. Only when the other person's right, he said. She looked down at Pepper, scratched the dog's ears with the automatic affection of someone who has accepted that the animal is going to be in her lap, whether she invited it or not. Thank you, she said quietly. Not the reflexive thank you she sometimes used to close a conversation. The real one. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow, she said. She didn't sleep in on the 1st of May, but she did, for the first time since the calving started, leave the breakfast to Danny and stay in her room until 7 o'clock, which for her was the equivalent of sleeping until noon. When she came downstairs, her hair was down, loose, which he had never seen before, and she was wearing a different dress, not her work one. She looked, in the morning light through the kitchen window, like a person who had been given a small piece of herself back. He was at the table with his accounts when she came through. He looked up. She looked back at him. He looked back down at his accounts. Good morning, she said. Morning, he said. And they were fine. They were exactly fine. Outside, the May light was coming in at that low morning angle that turned everything gold, and the garden, her garden, which had been dead ground 8 months before and was now showing the first green of the season, was just visible through the window, bright and improbably alive. The summer that followed was the best the ranch had seen in years, and nobody could say exactly why. The rains came at the right intervals, not too heavy, not too sparse, and the cattle put on good weight, and the hay crop came up thick enough that Caleb contracted to sell the surplus to 2 neighboring spreads that hadn't fared as well. By June, the south pasture was green in a way that made Roy Stubbs, who was not a man given to sentiment about grass, stop his horse on the ridge and look at it for a full minute before riding on. But the land was only part of it. Mara's garden had come fully alive by late May, and by June it was producing in earnest. Beans and squash and 3 kinds of herbs, tomatoes climbing the stakes she and Pete had put in during an afternoon that had involved more argument about stake spacing than any reasonable person would have predicted. She had added a row of sunflowers along the east fence that had no practical purpose and that she had planted anyway, and they were tall now, turning their faces in slow daily arcs, and they made the whole yard look like it was paying attention to something. She had started selling excess produce to Dottie Crane's boarding house, which was a thing she'd arranged herself without telling Caleb until after the fact. He'd found out when Dottie mentioned it in passing when he was in town, and he'd come home and found Mara in the garden tying up the bean plants and said, "Dottie tells me you're supplying her kitchen." Mara had glanced up. "The garden's producing more than we can use. It made sense. You could have mentioned it." "I'm mentioning it now." She tied off a knot. "The money goes back into the household budget. I'm not keeping it." He stood there for a moment. "I didn't think you were keeping it." "I know. I'm just telling you where it goes so you don't have to wonder." She moved to the next plant. If you'd rather I didn't, I'll stop. But Dottie was paying more for worse produce from the merchant, and this way she saves money and I use what would otherwise go to waste. It's a good arrangement, he said. I thought so. He watched her work for a moment. The efficient, careful way her hands moved through the plants, checking each one, pulling a weed here and there. You didn't ask me, he said. Not accusatory, just noting it. She looked at him then, directly. No, I didn't. She held the look for a moment. I've spent most of my life asking permission for things I was capable of deciding myself. I'm trying to stop doing that. He thought about that on the walk back to the house. He thought about it for several days, actually, because it said something about where she'd come from that he didn't like thinking about. The years of institutional life, of being managed, of having the small decisions of daily existence controlled by whoever happened to be in authority. The children's home. Then Dottie's boarding house. And now here, and she was still, deliberately, unlearning the reflex. He resolved not to give her reasons to relearn it. The trouble with the Aldous brothers came to a head in July. It had been building since spring, in the way that things build when people are in close quarters and working hard, and not communicating well about the things that matter. Danny had been offered a position on a larger spread 2 counties north, so better pay, more responsibility, a chance that didn't come to a ranch hand in his mid-20s very often. And he hadn't told Tom yet. Tom found out from Pete, who had heard it in town, and by the time Caleb came in for the midday meal, the two of them were at it in the yard with the specific ferocity of brothers who have been practicing their arguments on each other since childhood. The fight was loud and covered a lot of ground. The new job, yes, but also every grievance from the past year and some from before that, and some that seemed to be surrogates for things neither of them knew how to name. Tom's position was that Danny was leaving him. Danny's position was that Tom couldn't stand it when anything changed. And underneath both positions was a fear about what happened to brothers when they stopped being in the same place every day. Caleb stood at the edge of it for a few minutes, trying to decide whether to intervene, which was always the question with the Aldous brothers. Sometimes intervention helped, and sometimes it poured water on a grease fire. He was still deciding when he became aware that Mara was standing beside him. Let them finish, she said quietly. They're going to say things they can't take back. Maybe, she said, but if they don't say those things out loud, they'll carry them for years. She paused. Let them get to the bottom of it. He stayed where he was. The argument ran another 10 minutes and got loud enough that Pepper retreated to the kitchen steps and Roy appeared from the barn to watch from a safe distance. Then it hit its bottom. Tom said something with a cracked quality in his voice that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with loss. And Danny went quiet, and the shape of the thing changed. Danny left 2 weeks later. His last evening, Mara made a meal that was better than the occasion strictly required. Roast chicken, which was a luxury, and she produced a jar of preserved peaches from somewhere and set them on the table without comment. Danny ate 2 helpings and didn't say much. And at the end, Tom punched his brother on the shoulder in the way that men express things they can't say, and Danny punched him back. After Danny was gone, Tom was quiet for a week. Mara left him alone mostly, except for one evening when she put a piece of pie in front of him without being asked, the kind that was his preference and that she only made occasionally. He looked at it and then at her. How'd you know? He said. Know what? That pie would help. She considered this. It doesn't help, she said. But it's something good in the middle of something hard. Sometimes that's all you can offer. Tom didn't answer, but he ate the pie. The summer also brought Caleb's cousin, a man named Fletcher Mercer, who arrived on a Thursday in August unannounced, which was how Fletcher did everything, with a horse in better condition than his clothes and an opinion about the ranch that he had no qualifications to hold. Fletcher was 32, handsome in the way that made it easier for him than it should have been, and the kind of man who divided the world into opportunities and disappointments and was perpetually revising which category things belonged to. He had been in mining, speculation, cattle brokering, and at least one venture involving a printing press that he declined to discuss. He and Caleb had grown up together, and there was genuine affection between them beneath the friction, the way there is between people who know each other well enough to see the worst parts clearly. He swept into the ranch yard on a Thursday afternoon, shook Caleb's hand with both of his, and began assessing the property with the open, evaluative look of someone doing the math. Caleb watched him do it and felt the familiar, wary affection. You're looking well, Fletcher said. Ranch is looking well. Something's different. Good season, Caleb said. Maybe. Fletcher was still looking around the yard, at the garden, at the clean-swept porch. Who's the woman? Mara had come to the kitchen door at the sound of the horse. She stood there with a dish towel in her hands, taking in the visitor with the quiet assessment she applied to most things. Mara Quinn, Caleb said. She manages the household. Manages the household, Fletcher repeated, as if the phrase contained something more interesting than its surface. He tipped his hat toward her. Fletcher Mercer, Caleb's cousin. I'm the better-looking one. He says that, Mara said, but the hat's doing a lot of work. Fletcher laughed genuinely, which was not something he did easily. He looked at Caleb with an expression that said something Caleb didn't appreciate. I like her, Fletcher said. Don't, Caleb said. Fletcher stayed 4 days. In that time, he managed to eat everything Mara put in front of him with extravagant appreciation, attempt to charm Roy Stubbs into telling him stories about the ranch's history, and fail completely, and have a conversation with Caleb on the second evening that Caleb had been half expecting since his cousin arrived. They were on the porch after supper, the sun going down behind the western ridge, and Fletcher had his boots up on the rail in the way that drove Caleb quietly insane, and he said, She's not just managing the household. Don't, Caleb said again. I'm making an observation, a genuine one. Fletcher looked at the yard, at the garden, at the dog on the steps. This place has a different feeling than the last time I was here. It's not the grass or the cattle. You can feel that someone gives a damn about it. About the whole thing. Caleb didn't say anything. She looks at you, Fletcher said. I don't think she knows she's doing it, but she does. Fletcher, I'm just saying what I see. What you see and what's your business aren't the same thing. Fletcher put his boots down and looked at his cousin. Are you going to do something about it, or are you going to spend another year being carefully reasonable? Caleb looked at the ridge. She works here. I know she does. That's a complication, not a barrier. Fletcher picked up his coffee cup. You're not a stupid man, Caleb. Don't make a stupid decision by making no decision at all. Caleb didn't respond to that. But he thought about it after Fletcher left, riding out on Saturday morning with his good horse and his bad hat and a wave over his shoulder. He thought about it in the way you think about things that someone else has said that you already knew and hadn't allowed yourself to fully acknowledge. She looked at him. He'd noticed. He'd been noticing for months. The thing was, he still wasn't sure what to do with that, because the situation remained what it was. She was here because she'd needed work, and the gap between her position and his was real, and the last thing he wanted was for her to feel that some expectation had been placed on her that she had to navigate. He had seen enough of what she'd come from to understand that she'd been navigating other people's expectations her whole life. So he didn't say anything. He was careful. He told himself that careful was the right thing. September arrived with a specific quality of light that happened only in early fall, golden, slanted, making everything look like a painting of itself. And with it came a problem that had been visible on the horizon for weeks, and that Caleb had been avoiding thinking about clearly. The mortgage. His father had taken it out during a bad year, and Caleb had been servicing it since he inherited the property, which he had done steadily and without great difficulty in good years. This year had been good in terms of cattle and hay, but the spring repairs after the ice storm, the additional calving hands, and 3 equipment failures in quick succession had put him in a position where the fall payment was going to be tight. Not impossible, but tight in a way that required decisions. He sat with the ledgers 2 evenings in a row and came up with numbers that he could make work, but only barely, and only if he didn't pay himself anything for 3 months, and delayed 2 purchases he'd planned for the barn. He was on his 3rd hour with the ledgers on the 2nd evening when he heard the chair across the table scrape back and looked up to find Mara sitting down. She looked at the papers. May I? He was surprised enough that he said yes before he'd thought about whether to. She pulled the ledger toward her and read it with the same focused attention she brought to everything, her finger tracking down the columns. She was quiet for several minutes. Your hay sale, she said. You contracted 2 spreads? Yes. At what rate? He told her. She looked at the ledger again. If you went to the Hendersons, she meant a family 5 miles west, decent people with a small operation who had been struggling. They'd need hay too, probably more than they could afford from the merchant. If you offered them a rate between what you contracted and what the merchant charges, they could afford it and you'd still come out better than carrying the excess. He looked at where she was pointing in the ledger. She was right. It was a gap he'd looked past because he'd stopped his calculations at the existing contracts. Also, she said, the food budget for the past 3 months has had a line item for salt pork that we've been consistently underspending because I found a better source in town. I've been logging it, but I don't think you've looked at that column. He looked at that column. There was a meaningful amount sitting there, accumulated over 3 months, that he had not registered. Why didn't you say something? He asked. I thought you knew, she said simply. I assumed you checked the detail columns. I checked the totals mostly. I see that now. She said it without reproach. She pulled a blank piece of paper toward her and wrote 3 numbers on it. If you do the Henderson deal and redirect this surplus, you can make the payment and keep your barn purchases. Not comfortably, but you can make it work. He looked at the numbers. He looked at her. Where did you learn to read ledgers? She was quiet for a moment. I kept the books at the children's home for 2 years, she said. When I was 16, the administrator figured out I could add faster than he could. It wasn't the most exciting thing I've ever done, but it turned out to be useful. It did, he said. She pushed the ledger back toward him. The Henderson deal. Do you want me to speak to them? I know Clara Henderson from the farmer's market. She'd be easier to approach than going through him directly. He opened his mouth and then paused. Would you want to do that? She met his eyes. I'm suggesting it, so yes. He realized he'd been about to say something along the lines of, you don't have to, which was a thing people said to women in 1878 to make their offers feel optional and therefore smaller. He caught it. Yes, he said instead. I'd appreciate that. She spoke to Clara Henderson the following week at the market. The deal was struck before Caleb had finished loading the wagon. Henderson himself came by the ranch the following Thursday to shake Caleb's hand and ended up staying for coffee, during which Mara sat at the kitchen table and said almost nothing while Henderson talked. And when he left, Caleb noticed she'd refilled the man's cup twice and directed the conversation, subtly and without anyone noticing, away from 2 subjects that were visibly making the older man uncomfortable. You do that on purpose, Caleb said after Henderson's wagon had cleared the yard. Do what? Move conversations. You see where they're going, and you just redirect them, before anyone realizes what's happening. She washed out the coffee cups. I learned it at the home, she said. When one of the children was about to say something that would get them in trouble, you learned to redirect. He thought about that, about a 16-year-old girl keeping books and managing conversations and making herself useful in every way available to her, and doing all of it in service of other people, and growing up in the process without anyone particularly noticing that she was doing so. You ran that place, he said. She set the cups on the shelf. I helped run it, she said. There's a difference. There might not be as much difference as you think. She turned and looked at him, and for a moment something moved in her expression. Not discomfort exactly, but the expression of a person being seen in a way they haven't learned to receive yet. She looked away first. The Henderson deal was the right call, she said, returning to the practical. The fall payment will be fine. The fall payment will be fine, he agreed. She moved to the door, then she stopped, her hand on the frame, her back still to him. Caleb, she said. She almost never used his first name. He noticed every time. Yeah, he said. I'm glad I came here, she said. Quiet, direct. The way she said things she meant fully. I want you to know that. He held very still. I'm glad you did too, he said. And then, because it needed to be said and he was tired of finding reasons not to say it, more than you probably know. She didn't turn around, but he saw her breathe, one deliberate breath in and out. Then she walked down the hallway toward the kitchen, and he heard the stove door open and the particular sound of her adding wood to the fire the way she always did in the early evenings, building it up for the hours ahead. Outside, the September light had gone fully golden, and the sunflowers along the east fence were turning for the last time in the season, and the ranch sat in the late afternoon of a good year looking like something a person could believe in. October came back around, and with it the 1-year mark of Mara's arrival at the ranch, though neither of them mentioned it directly. The way you sometimes don't mention things that feel too significant for casual acknowledgement. The town had noticed her by then. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the way small towns notice things eventually, through accumulation. The Henderson deal had circulated, because Henderson himself had mentioned it to enough people that the story developed its own momentum. The surplus produce she'd been supplying Dottie had made her name familiar among the women who ran kitchens. And the festival was coming again, the second one since Caleb had crossed that cleared ground and asked her to dance. And this time, when Mara arrived with Caleb in the hands, nobody acted like they'd never seen her before. Clara Henderson found her within 10 minutes and pulled her into a conversation about winter squash storage. Two women from the church auxiliary, who would not have known her name a year ago, greeted her by it. Pete, watching from nearby with a cup of cider, leaned toward Roy and said, "It's different this year." Roy, who had thought so since August, said nothing. Caleb watched her move through the social landscape of the festival with the same focused attention he'd brought to watching her work for a year. She was not a natural at parties. She didn't have the fluid ease of people who had grown up surrounded by social occasions. But she was genuine, and people responded to that in ways they couldn't always explain. She listened when others spoke. She remembered things. She asked questions that made people feel their answers mattered. She still ended up near the serving tables at some point in the evening, which was habit more than necessity. Her hands needed something to do at crowded events. But this time Clara Henderson came and stood beside her, and they talked for half an hour side by side, and it looked like something that had always been there rather than something new. Caleb danced with her twice again. She was better this year, or more accurately, she let herself be better, which was different. The first time she'd held something back, some last layer of caution. This time, she didn't. She let the music move her the way it wanted to, and she laughed once at something he said, a real laugh, head back slightly, and he felt it land somewhere in the center of his chest and stay there. Afterward, walking back toward the hitching post where their horses were tied, she said, "It's different here this year." "I noticed that too. People know my name," she said. Not with vanity, more like someone checking whether something they'd been told was true. "They do," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I don't entirely know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it," he said. "It's just true." She looked at him sideways. "You made that happen," she said. "Not me." "No," he said. "You made it happen. I just noticed you first." She didn't answer that, but she didn't look away either, and they stood there for a moment in the dark beside their horses, the music still going behind them and the fire throwing orange light across the edge of the festival ground, and something between them that had been patient for a long time was running out of patience. He said, "Mara." "I know," she said. "I haven't said anything yet. I know what you're going to say." He looked at her. "What am I going to say?" She turned toward him fully. In the firelight, her face was serious, the way it got when she was paying close attention to something that mattered. "You're going to say that you have feelings for me and that you've been careful about it and that you want to know if I feel the same way and that whatever I say, you'll respect it." She paused. "Am I wrong?" "No," he said. "That's more or less it." "Then I'll save you the trouble." She held his gaze. "I do. Feel the same way. I have for a while." She said it plainly, without softening it or dressing it up, the way she said everything she meant. "I was waiting to be sure it was real and not just—" She stopped. "Not just what?" "Not just gratitude," she said. "Not just relief at having somewhere to be. I've been careful about the difference." He nodded slowly. "And you're sure now?" "I'm sure," she said. "I've been sure since May, if I'm honest. I just needed to know it wasn't going to leave." He thought about May, about the morning with the loose hair and the light through the kitchen window and the garden coming up green. "It's not going to leave," he said. She breathed out. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. They rode home with the hands, nothing outwardly changed, everything inwardly rearranged. Pete was telling a story about something that had happened at the barrel races. Tom was half asleep in his saddle. Roy rode ahead as he always did, his horse knowing the road by memory. Mara rode beside Caleb, and occasionally, on the straight flat sections where the road was wide enough, their horses moved close enough that their knees almost touched. Almost. The gap was small and neither of them closed it yet, but both of them knew it was there. November was not kind. It started with a letter. Mara got it on a Tuesday, brought in with the weekly post from town, and Caleb knew something was wrong before she said a word because of the way she stood at the kitchen table after opening it, very still, the letter in both hands. "What is it?" he asked. She set the letter down. "The girl I told you about," she said. "Out west. The one I've been writing to." A pause. "She died." He didn't say anything immediately because there was nothing immediately useful to say. He came and stood beside her at the table. The letter was in a handwriting he didn't recognize. Someone else writing on behalf of the situation, relaying what had happened. He didn't read it. It wasn't his to read. "What was her name?" he asked. "Lena," she said. "Lena Marsh. She was at the home the last 2 years I was there. She was 12 when I left." Her voice was steady in the way that voices get when the person has decided to keep them that way through force of will. "She was 19. He put his hand on the back of her chair. Not on her, just near her. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have done more," she said. "You sent her money. You wrote letters. I should have gone out there." She picked up the letter and folded it back into its envelope. "I kept thinking I would, when I had enough saved. When the timing was better." She stopped. The sentence didn't need finishing. He understood the specific torture of that. The perpetual almost enough that runs out before the moment it was being saved for. "You couldn't have known," he said. "No," she agreed, "but I knew she needed more than letters." She put the envelope in her apron pocket, and that was how she carried it for the rest of the day. In her pocket, close, the weight of it something she seemed to feel she owed. She cooked supper, she ate, she answered when spoken to, adequately. She was not, to any outside eye, dramatically different, but the light behind her face was off in a way Caleb could see because he'd been looking at her face for a year. After supper, when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was cleaned, he found her on the back porch in the cold, sitting on the steps with Pepper pressed against her side and her arms around the dog. He brought 2 blankets, kept one, put one around her shoulders without asking. "You should go inside," she said. "It's cold." "I know," he said, and sat down beside her. They sat there for a while. The sky was clear and full of stars, and the cold had that crystalline quality that made the air feel thin. Pepper eventually redistributed himself so he was partially across both of them, which he had no business doing, and neither of them moved him. "She reminded me of myself," Mara said finally. "When I met her, she was 8 years old, and she already knew how to make herself small, how to stay out of the way." She was quiet. "I taught her to read properly. She was bright, quick, the way some children are. She could have—" She stopped again. "I know," he said. "She deserved better," Mara said. Not angrily, just as a plain statement of something true that the world had failed to act on. "Yes," he said. "She did." He didn't try to draw lessons from it, or find the silver, or tell her it wasn't her fault in the way that people say things because they're uncomfortable with grief, rather than because the things are useful. He just sat there in the cold with her while the stars wheeled overhead and Pepper breathed heavily across their laps, and that was enough. Sometimes enough was all there was. She leaned her head against his shoulder sometime after midnight. She didn't do it dramatically, didn't announce it. She was simply there, her temple against the edge of his shoulder, her breathing gone slower and deeper, and he stayed perfectly still so as not to disturb it. They sat there until the cold became too serious to ignore, and then they went inside. Nothing was said about it. Nothing needed to be. December came and the ranch prepared for winter, with the particular focused industry of people who knew what winter cost and respected it accordingly. The firewood stacks were high this year, higher than the year before. The root cellar was full. The garden had been put to bed properly, the beds mulched and covered. The cattle were in better condition than they'd been in years, which Roy noted in his quiet way by not complaining about them, which was as close to praise as Roy got regarding anything with 4 legs. The hands felt it, that the ranch was going into winter from a position of adequacy rather than scramble. Pete was easier in his temperament. Tom, still adjusting to his brother's absence, had settled into a quieter version of himself that was not worse, just different. Roy was Roy. And Caleb was different. He knew it, and he suspected other people knew it, though none of them would say so because they weren't the type. He spent more evenings in the sitting room now, and Mara often worked there too, her mending, her letters, her reading. They had discovered, over the course of the fall, that they were capable of spending long hours in the same room without talking and finding it comfortable rather than tense, which was a thing that sounded simple and wasn't. He read. She wrote. The fire did its work. Pepper occupied whatever space was available. They talked too. Real conversations, the kind that went somewhere. About the ranch, about plans for the spring, about the book she was reading that she'd borrowed from the Henderson household and he should read next. About Danny's letters from the North Spread, which arrived monthly and were improving in their description of weather, which Danny had apparently decided was a topic safe enough for correspondence. About her childhood, in pieces, the way she gave things, gradually, at her own pace, a little at a time. He learned that she had taught 3 of the younger children at the home to read, using newspaper pages because there were not enough books. He learned that the administrator had been decent, a tired man doing an underfunded job, and that she felt ambivalent about him, grateful and resentful in proportions that shifted depending on which memory surfaced. He learned that she had wanted, at some point, to be a teacher, and that the wanting had been so fragile and impractical that she'd stopped allowing herself to think about it somewhere around age 50. "You'd be a good one," he said. She looked up from her mending. "I know," she said simply, without false modesty. "That's what makes it harder." One evening in mid-December, he came in from the cold with a problem that had been sitting at the back of his mind for 2 weeks, growing less manageable the longer he let it sit there. He came into the sitting room, still in his coat, and didn't sit down. She looked up. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," he said. "I need to say something." She set the mending down. She waited. He took his coat off, hung it on the chair back, and sat down across from her. He had rehearsed this, and the rehearsal was no help whatsoever, because she was looking at him with that clear, patient attention, and every careful sentence he'd prepared had the feeling of a suit that didn't quite fit. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not as an employee, not just—" He stopped, started again. "I want you to stay as the person this place belongs to, same as me." She was very still. "I'm asking you to marry me," he said, plainly, so there's no way I'm misunderstood. "I want to marry you. I want to build this ranch with you, and I want it to be yours as much as it's mine, and I want—" He stopped himself before the list got away from him. "That's it. That's what I want." The fire made its sounds. Pepper lifted his head, looked at both of them, put it back down. Mara was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Not quite any of the ones he'd catalogued over the past year. Something more open than her usual manner, and something underneath it that looked unmistakably like fear. "Caleb," she said, "I know it's—" "Let me finish." She pressed her hands flat on her knees. "I want to say yes. I do. But I need you to understand what you're asking." She held his gaze. "I have never in my life had something I was afraid to lose. Do you understand what I'm saying? I have made it through every bad thing by telling myself that what I didn't have couldn't be taken from me." Her voice was controlled and even, but he could hear what was underneath it. "If I say yes and this goes wrong, it won't be like losing a job. It won't be like losing anything I've lost before." "I know," he said. "I don't think you do," she said. "I don't think you can, entirely, because you've had things to lose your whole life and you know how to carry that. I don't." She looked at the fire for a moment. "I'm afraid," she said. "I want you to know that I'm afraid, and that me being afraid doesn't mean the answer is no. It just means I'm telling you the truth about where I am." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "The answer can wait," he said. "I'm not asking you to decide in the next 5 minutes. I needed to ask." She looked back at him. "I know," she said quietly. The clock on the mantel measured out the silence between them, and it was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people sitting with something real, which is different from every other kind of silence. Pepper got up, walked in a slow circle, and settled back down against Mara's feet, which was where he always ended up. "Ask me again in the morning," she said finally. He blinked. "What?" "Ask me in the morning," she said, "when I haven't just sat with it for 5 minutes, when I've had the night to—" She made a small gesture. "Ask me when it's daylight." He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. She picked up her mending. He picked up his book. The fire burned. Neither of them read or sewed a single thing for the remainder of the evening, but they sat there anyway, and the house held them both in the particular way it had been doing all year. Imperfect, solid, real. He was up before dawn. That wasn't unusual. He was always up before dawn, had been since he was 12 years old, and his father started waking him for the morning chores with the understanding that the ranch didn't wait for anyone's sleep schedule. But this particular morning he was awake before the alarm of habit, lying in the dark with his eyes open, listening to the wind move around the corners of the house and thinking about whether asking again in the daylight was going to feel as clear as it had felt the night before. It did. That was the thing. He'd half expected the night to complicate it, to lie there reviewing the risks, the complications, the 100 reasonable arguments for caution, and instead he'd slept better than he had in weeks. Whatever happened this morning, the asking had been right. He was sure of that in the uncomplicated way he was sure of very few things. He dressed, went downstairs, and found the kitchen already lit. She was at the stove. Of course she was. Pepper was at her feet, and the coffee was made, and the smell of something baking had already reached the hallway. She heard him come in and turned, and she looked like she hadn't slept particularly well, which he noticed without remarking on. She poured him coffee. He took it. They stood on opposite sides of the kitchen in the early morning quiet, the way they'd stood in this kitchen dozens of times over the past year, and it was familiar and also not familiar at all. "Good morning," he said. "Morning," she said. He set the coffee down. "Mara." "Yes," she said. He stopped. "I haven't asked yet." "I know." She turned back to the stove, checked whatever was baking, closed the oven. Then she turned to face him again, her arms crossed over her apron, her expression serious and also somehow settled, the way she looked when she'd made a decision and was done arguing with herself about it. "I've been awake since 3 o'clock, she said. "I've had a lot of time to think." She paused. "The answer is yes. I want you to know it's not because I'm afraid of going backward. It's because I actually want this." That took me a while to be able to say, but it's true. He looked at her across the kitchen. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. "That's—" He stopped. He'd had things to say, and they had left him entirely. "I had a speech." The corner of her mouth moved. "How long was it?" "Moderately long." "You can tell me later," she said. "Right now the biscuits need another 10 minutes, and Roy will be in here in 20, and I'd rather not explain to him why you're making a speech at 6 in the morning." He laughed. He hadn't expected to laugh. It came out of him genuine and easy, the kind of laugh that happens when relief and absurdity arrive at the same moment. And she watched it happen with an expression that was fond and slightly surprised, as if she hadn't fully anticipated what it would look like when he was simply happy. "Later then," he said. "Later," she agreed, and went back to the biscuits. And he drank his coffee, and when Roy came in 20 minutes later, he found them both at the table in what appeared to be ordinary morning silence, and understood, in the way that old men who have been paying attention their whole lives understand things, that something had shifted. He poured his coffee and sat down and said nothing, and that was how the three of them had breakfast on the morning that changed everything, eating biscuits that were very good, while the December light came up slow and gray over the eastern ridge. The telling happened in pieces over the following days. She told Roy first, not because she planned to, but because Roy asked her directly, standing in the yard on a Tuesday with his hat in his hands, which was Roy's version of formal. He said, "I heard something," and she said, "Probably true." And he nodded once, replaced his hat, and said, "Good. That's good," and went back to the barn. And that was the entirety of Roy's response to the news that would reorganize the household he'd lived in for 11 years. Pete's response was the opposite of Roy's. He made noise about it for the better part of an afternoon, cycling through enthusiasm. Several questions that were none of his business and that Mara declined to answer, and a complicated emotion that was partly genuine happiness and partly the dawning realization that things were going to change in ways he hadn't yet mapped. Tom shook Caleb's hand at supper that evening with a gravity that was touching in someone his age, and then shook Mara's hand too, which made her look slightly startled, and then Tom turned red and sat down. Fletcher sent a letter from wherever he currently was that said, in its entirety, "I told you so. Congratulations to you both. Don't invite me to the wedding unless there will be good food." Mara read it and said she supposed she liked him, and Caleb said that was the correct amount to like Fletcher. The wedding was set for February, which gave them 2 months and was not quite enough time, but they didn't want to wait longer, and February was the month when the ranch work was lightest, which was the most practical consideration and the one they both, being who they were, weighted heavily. Mara wrote letters to Clara Henderson, to people in town she'd come to know, to the 2 or 3 women from the children's home she'd stayed in contact with over the years. There was a woman named Sister Agatha who had been the home's cook and who had taught Mara to make cornbread, among other things, who wrote back within a week to say she was coming if she had to walk. She didn't have to walk. She arrived 3 days before the wedding on a mail wagon, 71 years old, shaped like a barrel, and possessed of the kind of personality that made rooms feel smaller. She took one look at Caleb, said, "You'll do," and went inside to critique the kitchen arrangement, which she did thoroughly and without apology. Mara followed her through this assessment with an expression on her face that Caleb had not seen before. Younger, somehow. The expression of someone who has been returned, briefly, to an earlier version of themselves. Sister Agatha had clearly occupied a specific and irreplaceable role in her formation, and watching Mara with her, Caleb understood something he hadn't fully understood before, that the absence of family doesn't mean the absence of people who shaped you. It just means those people are harder to find and further apart, and you carry them differently. "The herb storage is wrong," Sister Agatha announced from the pantry. "I know," Mara said. "I've been meaning to reorganize it." "You've been meaning to for how long?" "Several months." The old woman came out of the pantry with a bundle of dried thyme and looked at it critically. "The cornbread recipe I gave you, you still use it?" "Every week." Sister Agatha looked at her with something that was gruff and warm at once. "Good," she said. "Don't let anyone change it." "No one's tried," Mara said. The old woman glanced at Caleb, who was standing in the doorway. "He like it?" "He's the one who noticed it first," Mara said. Sister Agatha looked at him with a slight reassessment. She said, and went back to examining the pantry. The wedding happened on a Saturday in the second week of February. It was cold, and it was clear, which was the best the season could offer, and was enough. The ceremony was brief. Neither of them wanted long ceremony, and the man who performed it had known Caleb since he was 10 years old and kept it to the essentials. The people who came filled the ranch house and spilled onto the porch and into the yard, which was more people than either of them had expected, and the fact of it kept catching Mara off guard in a way she handled by looking at the ground for a moment and then back up, steadying herself against the reality of it. Clara Henderson cried. Dottie Crane did not cry, but made a sound that was practically indistinguishable from crying and then denied it loudly to anyone nearby. Tom stood in the back with his jaw set in the way of young men who are determined not to feel something in public. Roy stood beside him and felt it openly, which was the privilege of older men who had stopped caring about the performance. Sister Agatha stood at the front, near enough to see everything, and watched Mara come through the room with the expression of a woman watching something she had hoped for and had not been certain would come. Later, she would tell Caleb, privately, that Mara at 12 years old had been the smallest person in the home and the most stubborn, and that she had always known the stubbornness would take her somewhere. She had not known it would take her somewhere this good. After, there was food. Of course there was food. This was Mara's wedding. And it was the best meal Pine Ridge had eaten in years, because she had made most of it herself and recruited Clara Henderson for the rest. And the argument between Mara and Clara over the pie recipes had been audible from the yard, but had apparently produced results because 3 people asked for the recipe before the evening was over. Caleb stood near the fire with a plate he hadn't eaten from and watched the room. He watched Mara move through it, accepting congratulations, feeding people, laughing at something Sister Agatha said, finding the Henderson children something to do so they'd stop running through the kitchen. She was doing what she always did, except that tonight she was doing it as the center of the occasion rather than its invisible machinery, and she was handling it with the slightly dazed quality of someone who has been handed something they wanted so badly they'd stopped letting themselves want it. He thought about the boarding house, a crowded dining room, a year and a half ago, and a piece of cornbread, and a moment when she'd looked up and he'd caught a glimpse of something that most of the room had been looking past for 2 years. He thought about what Fletcher had said, that he'd noticed her before anyone else. He had, and he'd thought about that a lot, about what it meant and what had made it possible, and he had arrived, over the past year, at a conclusion that felt more true the longer he sat with it. He had noticed her not because he was more perceptive than other people, or more generous, or better in any particular way. He had noticed her because he'd been looking. Most people weren't looking. Most people moved through crowded rooms in the direction of the familiar, the comfortable, the people who already reflected back what they wanted to see. She had been in that room every week, present and capable and worth knowing, and the town had looked past her not out of cruelty, but out of the ordinary human failure to pay attention to what doesn't announce itself. He had paid attention, that was all. It was not a virtue. It was a choice, and one he hadn't even fully made consciously at the time, but it had been the choice that changed everything. The years that came after were not uncomplicated because nothing worth having is. The winter of their third year brought a collapse in cattle prices across the territory that hit hard, and required decisions that kept them both up late over the ledgers, arguing sometimes, genuinely arguing, with raised voices and the specific frustration of two people who are smart and disagree, until they found their way through it. They came out the other side with a smaller herd and 2 new contracts that Mara had negotiated herself, having developed over 3 years a reputation in the county for being fair and difficult to fool, which turned out to be a combination people respected. They had children. Not easily. The first pregnancy was lost early, and the loss was the hardest thing Mara had navigated since Lena's death. And she navigated it in her characteristic fashion, which was quietly and thoroughly, and without performing grief she felt she didn't have the right to show. Caleb disagreed with this. They argued about it, about whether she was allowed to grieve something she had lost, and whether the answer to hard things was always to absorb them alone. And it was not a comfortable argument, and it didn't resolve cleanly. But they had it, which was different from the years she'd spent absorbing everything in silence, and different was better even when it was harder. 3 children came eventually. 2 boys and a girl, spread across 5 years. The boys were loud and physical, and took after Caleb in their relationship to the outdoors, and after Mara in their stubbornness, which was a combination that made their childhood an exercise in endurance for everyone around them. The girl was quieter, observant, with her mother's way of watching a situation before entering it. She learned to read at 4, which surprised no one who knew Mara, and by 6 she had strong opinions about herb storage. The ranch grew. Not fast. Caleb had no interest in empire building, and Mara was categorically opposed to debt-funded expansion, a position she held with the conviction of someone who understood exactly what happened to people who relied on borrowed stability. But steadily, in the way that things grow when they're tended consistently and with care. They bought the adjacent parcel when the Hendersons offered it in a good year. They built a proper barn that Roy, who was by then in his late 60s and technically retired but unable to stay away from the property, declared adequate, which was Roy's highest praise for a structure. Pete left and came back twice, in the manner of young men figuring out what they wanted. He eventually settled in Pine Ridge, married a woman who could argue with him on equal terms, and raised a family in a house he built himself with help from Tom, who never left, who was, years later, still on the property, older and weathered and steady, the closest thing to permanent the ranch had outside its owners. Sister Agatha died in the spring of Mara and Caleb's 7th year. She'd stayed in Pine Ridge after the wedding, which no one had planned, and had lived in a room at the Henderson place and attached herself to the community with the permanence of a woman who had decided this was her last place and intended to make use of it. She taught the Henderson children to cook. She argued with the minister about theology. She improved, through a combination of criticism and demonstration, the bread of 3 separate households. She was buried in the Pine Ridge Cemetery on a warm April afternoon, and Mara stood at the grave with her 3 children arranged beside her, and felt the particular weight of losing the last person who had known her before she was anything. Caleb stood behind her, close enough that she could feel his presence without needing to look. After, walking back to the wagon, their youngest asleep against her shoulder, she said, "She taught me to make cornbread when I was 9 years old." "I know," he said. "I didn't even like cornbread back then. She made me practice it anyway." She shifted the sleeping child. She said that knowing how to make one thing well was a form of dignity, that no one could take it from you. He thought about that for a moment, about a 9-year-old girl being taught that dignity could live in something as small and specific as cornbread, about the fact that the woman who had taught her that had, whether she knew it or not, set in motion a chain of events that led to an evening in a crowded boarding house and a piece of cornbread and a man who had finally been paying attention. She was right, he said. She was right about most things, Mara said. She was insufferable about it. It was 23 years after the wedding, a winter evening, the children long grown and the house both emptier and quieter, that Mara told him about the cornbread. They were sitting by the fire, the way they had sat by fires hundreds of times. He was reading. She was doing nothing in particular, which was something she'd had to learn to do and was now finally, in her late 40s, reasonably good at. Pepper had been gone for years, replaced by 2 subsequent dogs who were currently asleep on the rug with the commitment of animals who had never in their lives felt the need to justify their comfort. She said, out of the ordinary quiet, "I need to tell you something." He put the book down. In 23 years, he had learned that when she prefaced something that way, it was worth his full attention. "The cornbread," she said, "the night you came to the boarding house and praised it." "I remember," he said. She looked at the fire. "That piece was my supper," she said. "I had made 1 extra square. I counted wrong, or I was tired, I don't remember. And I'd set it aside because I was hungry and I knew there might not be anything left by the time the service ended." She paused. "Dottie's husband came in late and there wasn't enough for him and I gave him mine." She said it simply, without drama. "That was the piece you ate. I went to bed hungry that night." He was very still. She turned from the fire to look at him. Her expression was clear, a little wry, the expression of someone who has carried a small private thing for a long time and has finally decided it can be put down. "I never told you because I was embarrassed," she said. "I didn't want you to think I was angling for sympathy. And then later I didn't tell you because it felt like something that had happened to a different person and I didn't want to go back to her." He thought about that evening, the crowded dining room, a young woman in a gray dress moving through the work of feeding strangers, a square of cornbread in the corner of his plate that had been, without his knowing it, the only food she had that day. "You went hungry," he said. "I went hungry," she confirmed. "It wasn't the first time. It wasn't the last, for a while." She paused. But that particular night was different, because a stranger noticed, and he wasn't unkind about it, and he wasn't performing it. He just said the true thing in front of everyone. He looked at her across the firelight. 23 years, 3 children, 1 ranch, expanded and repaired and argued over and loved. A life built from a single square of cornbread that had belonged to her and that she had given away without being asked. "I owe you a piece of cornbread," he said. She laughed. Actually laughed. The full laugh. The one he still felt in the same place in his chest that he had felt it the night of the first autumn festival when she'd let herself be free for 20 minutes. "You've made it up to me," she said. "Several thousand times over." "Still," he said. "Still," she agreed, and she was still smiling, and the fire was doing its work, and outside the winter was doing its work. And inside the house, the 2 dogs breathed on the rug with the uncomplicated peace of animals who had been well-loved their whole lives. There's a thing that people miss, looking at lives like this one, when they tell the story from the outside. They see the arc of it, the chance meeting, the slow accumulation, the wedding, the years, and they make it into something ordained, something that was always going to happen, as if the outcome were visible in the beginning. But it wasn't. It was contingent every step of the way. It required a man who happened to be paying attention on a particular Thursday evening, a woman who happened to give her supper away, a question asked across a kitchen, a dance at a festival, a December doorway, a February morning. Any of those things, timed differently or received differently or not happening at all, and the whole structure fails to build. What held it together was not fate. It was 2 people, both shaped by loneliness in different ways, who had learned, one from abundance that felt empty, one from scarcity that required invention, that the thing underneath everything else, the thing that made the difference, was whether you were willing to look. Really look. At a person, at a piece of cornbread, at the small and unannounced things that carry the most weight. Mar had spent 20 years being overlooked by people who were not unkind, just inattentive. She had made her life in the gaps of other people's attention, building dignity out of herbs on a windowsill and letters to people who might not write back, and one recipe she had practiced until she could make it without thinking. Caleb had spent 26 years building something solid that still felt, in a way he couldn't name, like it was missing its essential thing. He had land and work and reputation. He did not have anyone to see him. Not the real seeing, the kind that goes past the surface of what a person presents to what they actually are. They gave each other that. Not perfectly, not without friction, not without the ordinary failures of two people living closely over decades, but genuinely and consistently, and with the particular attention of people who understand from experience what it costs to go unseen. The cornbread sat in the story the way small things sit in real lives, unassuming, easy to overlook, carrying everything.